Muy buenos días, buenas noches en
Good
China,
morning, good
buenos
evening in
días en
China,
América Latina.
good morning for Latin America.
A este
Welcome
seminario
to
en
this
línea
online
Desafíos
seminar,
post-pandemia,
Tourism Post-Pandemic
desafíos y
Tourism,
oportunidades
Challenges and
para China
Opportunities
y
for
América
China
Latina.
and Latin America.
Este webinar será
This webinar
impartido
is
en
going to
idioma
be
español,
given
chino,
in Spanish,
portugués
Chinese,
e
Portuguese,
inglés.
and English.
Pueden seleccionar su
You can
idioma en la
select
parte
your
de
desired
inferior
language at
en
the
la
bottom of
pantalla.
your screen.
Me presento, soy
I introduce
Roberto
myself. I'm
Lafontaine,
Roberto
director
Lafontaine,
del Centro
Director
de
of the
Cooperación
Center of
Internacional para el Enseño
International Cooperation
Tecnológico en
for the
China,
Teaching of the
Center
Chinese
for
Language.
Public Education and Cooperation, su oficina regional
Its
para
regional office
Latinoamérica
for
y el
Latin
Caribe.
America and the Caribbean.
Nuestro centro en
Our
América Latina
center
y el
in Latin
Caribe
America
se
and the
dedica a la
Caribbean is
enseñanza
dedicated to
del
the
idioma
teaching
chino en
of
las
Chinese
instituciones
language in
públicas y
public
privadas,
institutions, private
gobiernos
institutions,
nacionales, gobiernos
national,
locales,
local
instituciones de educación
governments,
superior,
higher education
instituciones
institutions,
de
and
educación secundaria y
secondary
privadas.
and primary education institutions as well.
Una de las áreas más
One of
afectadas
the
por
most
la
affected
pandemia
areas
es
by
el
the
sector de
pandemic
turismo.
was the
Con
touristic
las
sector.
restricciones de
With
viajes
the
y las
traveling
limitaciones
restrictions
a
and the
partir de hoy,
limitations up to this
podemos
day,
encontrar que el
even,
turismo se
we
ha
can find
enfrentado a
that
nuevos
tourism has
desafíos.
been facing new
Hoy,
challenges.
en este seminario en
Today,
línea,
in this online
estaremos
seminar,
abordando los
we will
viajes
be
entre China
addressing
y
the
América
trips
Latina,
between China and
viajes
Latin America,
trascontinentales que precisamente han sido los
transcontinental trips that
últimos
have
en
been
reactivarse.
the latest
¿Qué
ones
nos
to
depara el año
reactivate. So,
2023
what
y
is
los
left
años
for
que siguen?
2023 and the
¿Cuáles
upcoming
son las
years then?
áreas a las que
What
debemos
are the
poner
areas
atención?
that we should pay attention to?
Agradecemos desde
We would
ya
like to
a los
thank you as of
panelistas
now
que
to
abordarán
all of our panel
estas
members
y
who are
otras
going to be
temáticas.
addressing these and other topics as well.
Además, en la parte inferior de
Also,
la
at the
pantalla
bottom of your screen,
encontrarán la sección de
you will
preguntas y
find the
respuestas,
Q&A
donde
section
podrán enviar sus
where you
preguntas
can
a los
send your
panelistas
questions to
y
the
que
panel
serán
members,
respondidas
which
al
will
final
be
de esta
answered
sesión.
at the end of this webinar.
Quiero recordarles
I
que
would like to
este
also remind
webinar
you
está siendo
that this
grabado
webinar is
y
being
será enviado
recorded and will
posteriormente
be sent
al correo
later to
electrónico
the
donde
email
hicieron su
where
inscripción
you
y
registered.
también será
And
publicado
also
en
it's going to
nuestro
be
canal
published
de
in
YouTube.
our YouTube channel.
Quiero dar un saludo
I would
especial
also
hoy
like to
día
kindly
a
greet
nuestra
today
subdirectora
to
Sumi
our
Yang, que está en
sub-director,
Beijing,
Sumi Yang,
que
who
está
is
con
in
COVID.
Beijing
Le
today.
mandamos
She's
un
suffering from
fuerte
COVID,
abrazo
and we'd like to
esperando
send
que
her a
se
big hug,
recupere muy pronto.
and we wish for her full, soon recovery.
Para empezar,
To begin,
quiero presentar
I would like to
a nuestra
introduce the
ponente,
first speaker of today,
la señora Susan Rojas,
Mrs. Susan
máster en
Rojas,
Estrategia
an
Internacional
MA
Desarrollo
International
Social,
Strategy,
ingeniera de
International
proyectos,
Policies,
licenciada en
project
turismo.
engineer with Alliances in
Actualmente es
Tourism.
investigadora
Currently,
adjunta
she
en
is
el
a joint
Instituto de Estudios
researcher in the
Internacionales de la
Institute of
Universidad de Chile
International Researches of
y
the Universidad de
profesora
Chile,
en temas de
and also a
internacionalización de
consultant and
empresas, pymes y
internalization of
competencia
companies,
digital,
SMEs, and
desarrollando
business
estudios de
intelligence,
diálogo
developing
interamericano
studies
del
for the
desarrollo, la
IBD,
Alianza del
the
Pacífico
Alliance
y
of the
la
Pacific,
Asociación de
and the
Relaciones
subdirection
Económicas
of
Internacionales
International
y
Economic
preside
Relations
del
for
Ministerio
Chile
de Relaciones
of the
Exteriores.
Ministry of Interior
Se ha
Relationships in Chile.
especializado en el
She's been
mercado chino
specialized in the
con
Chinese and
más de
Asian
16
market with
años de
more than 16
experiencia
years of experience
en proyectos
in projects
multisectoriales,
that comprehend several
en
sectors
turismo y
in
sector
tourism
conferencial,
and conventions,
congresos, conferencias y
congresses,
exposiciones
conferences, and
internacionales.
international
Dejo
trade
con
shows.
ustedes
So,
a
with
la
you,
señora
I would
Susan
like to leave you
Rojas
with
con
Susan
el
Rojas
turismo
Villagra with
corporativo,
corporate tourism,
oportunidades y
opportunities, and
potencialidades entre
potentials
China y
between
América Latina.
China and Latin America.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
Roberto,
very
por
much,
todo este
Roberto. It
tiempo que
is a
nos
pleasure to
concede
be
en
sharing
este
some time
webinar.
with you in this webinar.
Un saludo al equipo
Kind
ECLEC
greetings
por la
to the
invitación
ECLEC
y también
team
a
for
todos
the
los panelistas
invitation
con
and
los
also
cuales
all of
vamos a
the
estar
panel members with
compartiendo hoy
whom we're
día en
going to
esta
be
jornada.
spending some time today.
Voy a compartir mi
I'm
presentación
going to be sharing my presentation now
que espero se vea
that I
como
hope you
me
can see full
indican
screen. Please let me
si no se
know
ve o si
if
hay
you can't
algún
see
tipo de
it or if there's any
retraso,
problem with it,
pero ya estamos en
but
condiciones de
we
iniciar.
are in
Ha
conditions
habido
to
una
begin
pequeña
it. So,
modificación
so there
al
was a
título
small
que habíamos
modification to
dado
the title I
inicialmente,
gave you
porque la
originally
idea es
because the idea
mostrar una
is
mirada
to
optimista
show
para
an
lo que es el
optimistic
turismo
view
corporativo
from corporate
y que a
tourism
su vez tiene una
and that
incidencia en otros
also
sectores.
this
Por
has an
eso
incidence in
el
other
título de hoy
sectors.
día es
The title
Corporate
today
Tourism en
is
China, América
Corporate Tourism,
Latina, una
China,
mirada
Latin America,
estratégica
a
y
strategic
multidimensional.
and multidimensional point of view.
Hoy día es imposible no
So
hacer
today it's
una
impossible
retrospectiva
not
y ver
to
todo
look
lo que hemos
back and
vivido en
see
este
everything that
proceso,
we've lived in this
al
process
cual nos ha
that we have been facing with COVID-19. Without a doubt, it has been very hard on everyone. And as of December 1st, 2018, when we heard of the first case in Wuhan, the world definitely was never the same. And because of that, when on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization was declaring this a world pandemic, on which we had no knowledge since 2002 and 2003, when we had the SARS outbreak, this became quite controversial worldwide. Clearly, we were facing a scenario that was not foreseen and that would alter the global dynamics in all of the possible aspects, from productive, economics, and social. Within this effect of COVID, here, this is very quickly to see the China effect, because since Latin America is very usual to say it, when China gets a cold, everyone gets sick. And this time it was literally like that. Clearly, what happened in China made the whole world sick in different magnitudes. But locally speaking, it also generated some instances that today are still affecting our economies, that are in a greater opening stage to what China is currently living. And in this context, we talk about the policy of zero COVID. The COVID policy is a radical effort of Chinese authorities to control the outbreak in Wuhan. And basically because of local health reasons, but also for this responsibility in in regards to the rest of the world to control it, so the effects were not as profound as they ended up being, despite the policies implemented in China. What does this mean for the Chinese population? Clearly, lockdowns and mass testing, the closing of its borders, and the restrictions of all trips that were done in groups or individually abroad. Unlike other countries, the zero COVID policy implemented by China has endured in time. And that is what maybe has generated the greatest impact in our economies, that clearly depend greatly on our main commercial partners, which in our case is China and the United States on the other part. The permanence in time we've lived through these last few days, where we did the last few announcements of the modifications that were going to be implemented in the policy. But some weeks ago, we saw how in spring in Shanghai, there were still lockdowns, and for about 2 months, they were in lockdown with with everything that that implies. For one of these main sources of China, both at a commercial level and internal dynamic of the country, as it is for international connectivity. What would this cause? A chain reaction. We're talking that the figures speak of a decrease of over 58% of passengers worldwide the first half of 2020, which is when we were already living the COVID process, compared to what was being registered in 2019. The China effect, we can size it in this way, for instance. China has two of the international airports that manages the most flow of tourists worldwide. And with that, we mean the Beijing airport and the Shanghai airport. So in the case of Beijing, we're saying that in the pre-pandemic period, they were mobilizing above 100 million passengers. However, those figures dropped to below 73%. And in the case of Shanghai, that moves more than 76 million passengers, the figure also was reduced to 68% in the first quarter of 2020. This is just to show the impact, but we're going to keep going through in a positive scenario, which is what we're living today. And that has us thinking of the strategies that we're going to be implementing to draw Chinese tourists to our lands. So this is the other concept, the local forecast, that we're saying that in the New Year, the Moon New Year, China will be in just those 3 days of holidays, the 7 million of international trips in the border. So this did not only imply a damage in the Chinese economy at a level of touristic activity, but also it was generalized. Clearly, there has been some monitoring by the central administration in order for these effects to be as mild as possible or can be mitigated in the short and medium term. We mean that we have youth unemployment of about 20% in China, there was a strong construction in the manufacturing industry as well, and also in investments. This is a bit biased from what was being dragged with the trade war with the United States and all the implications this has had in the investments linked to the supplies of global chains of value. So the focus for growth clearly is not as optimistic as what we had foreseen since 2019. And today we're talking about figures that it's going to be around 3%, very far away to the figures that usually we were used to with China, and they were close to 10 or 9 or even 8%. What is the scenario today? Scenario today is quite optimistic in the sense that at a global level, we are living a new stage. The virus has not gone anywhere, but we've learned to live with it, which means that we have more flexibility in the measurements taken in the different markets in order to make economy more dynamic and also make tourism more dynamic and the flow of tourists worldwide. The last figures thrown by the barometer of the World Tourism Organization tells us that this trend, this positive trend, is still rising, and the percentages of recoveries are very optimistic in the short and medium term. We mean that the arrival of international tourists just in the period of January and July of this year increased in 170%. And these percentages are always based on historic figures of the assessed periods. The markets with the greatest recovery has been Europe and Middle East. Europe, that has been over 190% of the trips in their last period. Also, Middle East, the Americas, and the Asia Pacific also has an increase of the movement of tourists of above 160%. But unlike the other markets, it's still remaining with a deficit that's greater than 86% compared to historic figures. In the case of China, the good news are practically since last week, because we had a first announcement in November where we were being shown that there was an availability of the Chinese administration to begin to generate certain flexibilities that would allow the flow of tourists, mainly internal tourists. If there's something we need to internalize here is that regardless of the measurements today being ongoing, for international tourism, just now we're going to be starting to see meaningful flows or a greater dynamic from March 2023. So that is in the short and medium term, but with a lot of awareness and also from that need of a very deep analysis of how this new flow of Chinese tourists will be from that is going to be exiting the borders. And this is not going to be the typical tourist that you had pre-pandemic. In terms of flexibility, we have two basic stages. In November, which was this announcement of the 20-point protocol, where they were making some measurements more flexible. So that would allow Chinese citizens to move among the provinces in their territory without as many requisites such as PCR tests or the health quarantines that they need to comply with in hotels, and so on and so forth. And a second stage that, well, this first announcement was ongoing, so we never got to see the completion of these 20 points of the protocol until December, where this has had some social influence that caused some events because of the isolation in some specific cities. China speed up the process and they started generating greater flexibility in the measurements that they were going to be implementing. And the good news is basically that people will be able to do their quarantines at home. Also, the restrictions to move from one province to the other is only based on a PCR test, and that people with mild cases of COVID were not going to isolation, but they can quarantine in their own household. Why is this so important for us? And to see that we have some lights of progress in the short term. Because China, while it is an important commercial partner in terms of export of goods for all of the countries in the world, also have become the main issuer of tourists worldwide. Tourists are very valued because, as we all know, these are tourists that have a level of expenditure that is quite high, and for local economies is quite beneficial in a more substantial way. Despite the flexibilities of trips, as it was previously mentioned, this process is just starting, and we have some light of what we're going to be forecasting in terms of statistics or specific strategies that we will know in 2023. However, the movement of tourists generated in China, because internal tourism in China kept moving people around. We're talking about official figures in the work on Labor Day of 230 million people that moved. And they showed some signs that are worth considering for our strategies. And these are basically three. First, Chinese tourists continue to rise with their demand for luxury. And that is a trend that was already showing pre-pandemic, but now is even at a greater scale. The private moving, that in domestic tourism is the rental of vehicles, but in long distance travel is hiring a private chauffeur, and also the bubble tour hiring, because we're talking about tourists that are not they're very wary about not getting sick on their first trip abroad, and they would like to do a bubble trip or with activities that are more enclosed, as we call them, in the touristic sector. So how do we address this competence that is coming for us Latin American countries? Being very objective, of course, we need to put our feet on the ground and start from the premise that will allow us to generate a strategy that's even smarter. And that is that basically Latin America was not before the pandemic, nor will be after the pandemic, the priority destination of Chinese tourists. So how do we compete with countries of Europe, of East Asia, of Southeast Asia, or Oceania that have tourist numbers that are a lot greater than ones that we have in Latin American countries? So here we have an example of the top 5 Chinese tourist destinations. This is pre-pandemic, of course. What were the favorite destinations of Chinese tourists? And that basically will replicate, of course, because this will continue this trend of internal tourism, regional tourism, so they can then start developing their medium and long distance journeys. So we have destinations such as Thailand that concentrate the biggest number of tourists in 2019, Japan, United States, France, and Australia. And in total, by 2019, pre-pandemic, China was having a flow of tourists that was roughly 155 million tourists. So what is our reality in that same scenario in 2019? Mexico was the main destination for Chinese tourists, followed by Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. So clearly the figures are very different to what we saw in the other markets. So therefore, our strategy needs to maybe talk not from competition of the touristic appeals of nature, landscape, culture, etc., that we're very used to put at the forefront, but from that, we have our main strategies for promotion of tourism. But we need to maybe take other signs that speak of strategic factors from which we can begin generating some interesting flows of tourists, but also in a smarter way. For instance, in the last session of APEC in November, the president was talking about the experience of Asia Pacific region and the Latin American countries for the Chinese market. This was done by Xi Jinping, and this was not only about tourism, but about the importance in terms of industrial chains and global supply chains, and also for food and energy security. So Latin America is one of the most important providers of Chinese economy for commodities and other goods and products that are basic for the production of the manufacturing industry of the Asian country. what are our strengths? Clearly, we need to start with our strategy from our strengths, from our productive strengths, thinking of strategic partnerships at a regional level. We're saying that in Latin America, our main resources is gold and copper, where we go full into mining. And today, energy is also an important factor in economic terms, agriculture, livestock, and industry. So, what should we aim to? To a corporate tourism that is conceived from a strategic view and a multidimensional view. And by multidimensional, I mean just get a step away from yourself and just exit this idea of just tourism as purely tourism and involve other productive sectors with it. So one of the instruments that is more efficient in terms of gathering professionals who move around the world for business are trade shows. In Latin America, we are speaking of about 850 trade shows that were done a year. Today, we're getting on that number. Again, we have a hybrid format. So if you analyze how we have been working on international events done in Latin America, the Chinese presence in the hybrid format has been very low or just almost non-consequential. But this could be due to the lack of support. And that is where we go into associating and partnering with other institutions such as the Confucio Institute, Clegg Foundation, etc., where we have more human resources that are trained and they can bridge these gaps generated by the language problems. So Chinese companies can use hybrid formats as a first instance to attend the LATAM trade shows. Globally, in 2019, we did more than 30,000 trade shows in 180 countries, attending with more than 300 million attendees or professionals, which meant more than 4.5 million companies participating in these activities and more than 270,000 US dollars, which are measured in terms of contracts and other goods generated from these trade show activities. In Latin America, the main markets for events and trade shows are Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia. Sorry, I need a sip of water. Bolivia, Chile, Uruguay, Ecuador, and Paraguay. So the supply is ever more diversified and more professional. And that we can see in the events of the different sectors where we find from business rounds, technical talks, lectures, technical visits, and many other opportunities that are related to the trade show, but that also promote the pre-tour and post-tour that could take place in the context of these type of events. In terms of the movement of professionals that do these trips around trade shows, 1 in 4 passengers in the world is related to trade shows, be that corporate, congresses, events, etc. So this is a strategic segment for the Latin American segment. If we want to begin now developing a strategy with the end of attracting a meaningful flow of Chinese tourists at a first stage. How can we, through corporate tourism, activate economic relationships between Latin American countries and China after the pandemic? Well, by using all of the externalities and the dimensions that a great potential tourist activity means that has a multiplying effect that has not been sized. We have had some improvements in some specific markets where they have wanted to do traceability or more specific measurement of what is the multiplying effect of the making of a trade show, but this has not been sustained in time, and therefore this would be a good space for statistic analysis to see the concrete results. What are these dimensions? So here is a general overview of how we should be conceiving this multidimensionality that is coming from for these trade shows as an opportunity for promoting tourism. This is a very rough draft, but this is to identify the areas that will be part of this new strategy that we could consider, even with an agenda of international events of productive sectors that are more specific, that could be worked on jointly among several countries. Just as we worked on the binational multinational tours, we can work on trade show agendas that are binational or multinational. This is the first stage, speaking about the conception of the project and pre-production, then the execution of the project that has a section where we start seeing the different dimensions that are stemming from this trade show activity. We have man hours, vendors, etc. I'm just showing you this because I want to show you an example with greater detail with a specific trade show, which is Expo Min trade show that is done in Chile. And this is a trade show that has been consolidated in the mining market, being one of the 3 most important trade shows done globally for mining. So how do we conceive these events? How do we know what sector we need to promote? Basically, we need to follow the traceability of our exports. Chile, particularly, their main export is copper. And therefore, of course, their strength is in industry, technology, services, and the capacity of HR will be in this area. So therefore, developing an event or promoting this event in that area would be way more efficient. And in that context, we have in parallel that China is our main commercial partners in terms of imports of mining Chilean products. I'm sorry, Susan, you're way over time, 5 minutes. Okay, I'll try to finish then. So here's the breakdown of the dimensions in which we would be generating this multiplying effect that is a multidimensional effect that generally is centered mostly on investment. But in the case of trade shows, we can do traceability that is even more extensive from products. So just to finish the final appreciations, the scenario is positive as in 2019, we're already having positive figures as Latin American markets for growth in terms of the flows of tourists that were coming from China. The percentages that I'm not going to detail now, and also now the scenario for taxing, because Latin America did not slumber through this process and did a lot of activities trying to attract Chinese tourists. And in that context, we're speaking of Costa Rica that apply the visa exemption for tourists that are coming from China after the pandemic. In the case of Argentina, that signed an agreement with Citrip to promote the flow of tourists towards the region. Chile, that also made a tourism website in China with an extension that is .cl and a number of other activities that we can leave for another webinar, maybe, where Latin America is trying to make a good effort into attracting Chinese tourists. So we have a need of macro articulation where we have some improvements, such as with the Pacific Alliance and the tourist sector, where we can include as a reference that we begin working bilaterally or multilaterally with trade shows and international events, working on the corporate segment so we can inclusively, without the distinction of gender or with a positive differentiation. The latest statistics show that the movement of women for businesses has been growing exponentially. Therefore, the strategies for capturing professionals that will visit our trade shows and exhibitions needs to also aim to an inclusion of gender. We need to expand the chance for promotion even beyond agencies. And there, my diagram I was showing that we have the ones that we all know, but we also have specific chambers, such as in the case of mining, the China Mining, from which we could generate some programs for associated companies so they can travel to the mining events in Latin America. Conceiving business events not only in terms of production, but also as a multi-sector effort. Digital culture, we've already seen how we've intensified the technological aspect globally, more specifically in China. So we need to be prepared to, for tourists or corporate Chinese tourists can just also use their payment methods digitally as they're used to do it in their home markets. And also triangulate efforts from the public, private sector, and the academia. So the high performance or the activities that we're going to be doing initially to attract this segment of the touristic sector will have the language experience support that will allow us that the flows of tourists to begin to arrive to our region from corporate events that I pointed out earlier. I am so sorry I was over the time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Susan. Muy interesante el tema y sin duda alguna es un esfuerzo y
Thank you very
visto
much, Susan. Very interesting. It is a great effort, not only for tourism as a traditional conception of tourism, but also from the multi-sector point of view, mixed with business tourism. I find that brilliant and a great opportunity for Latin America. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roberto. Now, I leave you with Professor Lin Minhui, PhD and Associate Professor of Forestry, Architecture and Landscaping School of the South China Agricultural University, member postdoctorate of the Institute of Tourism and Recreation of the University of Pennsylvania, Deputy Secretary General of the Professional Committee of Forest Recreation and Tourism in the Guangdong Forestry Society, expert in think tank in the Shaohuan Science and Technology Association. She also has presented projects in the Foundation of Natural Sciences of Guangdong, projects of research of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and also in planning and tourism design at every level, and also 20 articles in important Chinese and international magazines and publications. She also won the first award of she was awarded the first place in the contest, in the Tourism Tribune contest, and also the second place for excellency in teaching award in the Comprehensive Education Award for Sichuan Agricultural University, among others. Professor Lin Minhui will be presenting the sustainable tourism development in World Heritage Sites in towns and cities. Welcome, Professor.
好的，谢谢各位。请问可以看到吗？
Thanks, everyone. Please, if you can confirm that you can see my presentation.
好的，大家好，很高兴就是也很感谢雨禾中心的一个邀请。
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to participate in this event, and I am very thankful to the Clark Foundation for inviting me. I hope I can share with you one day in person. The topic of today is sustainable tourism development in World Heritage Sites in towns and cities, and under this perspective of the pandemic. So how can we sustain development in the tourism sector after the pandemic? I would like to tell you what UNESCO had said in 2000, which is what tourism is supposed to promote heritage conservation, but it has a limited role in heritage preservation or sustainable development. And tourism development and conservation of ancient cities have even become a contradiction. So how can we face the problems that the activation of tourism has brought to us, or the excess of trading or commercialization of tourism? So we have a lot of contradictions in these aspects. So that is where we are facing this problem of how can we develop tourism that is sustainable. And that is why today I would like to share the first topic with you, the commercialization of tourism in World Heritage Sites through two cases, the case of Lijiang and Shidi. And the second topic that I'm going to be sharing with you is about heritage tourism under the impact of COVID-19, transformations and opportunities. We're going to begin now, first, with the commercialization. These pictures that you can see here are villages that have been declared World Heritage in China. Imagine the golden week of holidays in this place that is completely saturated of tourists. Shaoshuang, Lijiang, you have the province of Yunnan. And what you can see here is this. This is before the pandemic, before 2020. But because of the opening or the gradual opening and lowering of restrictions, it's very likely that China will face this landscape of excess of tourism. What we can see is that this rise of tourism and in World Heritage sites and the dramatic growth of tourism and commercialization, we have an excess of all of these factors. And I believe that in this way, these have made these villages lose their identity and their vitality, and their whole life has been turned, and the life of the local people, they become a completely commercial site. They could just follow that commercial trend, but they will become, and they could transform, and this transformation will also transform their identity. So their traditional lives and livelihood will become a commercial life. So these World Heritage sites might finally turn into commercial sites, and therefore they will lose their culture and their identity. And that can make their culture disappear in the future, and even could mean that they will lose their registration as World Heritage. So this will have a negative impact, of course, for tourism. So how can we avoid these consequences? So more specifically, I believe that in the absence of external constraints with the development of tourism, is this really the commercialization of tourism in heritage villages and towns an inevitable phenomenon? So the second question would be, can this commercialization of heritage villages in towns in the process of tourism development can be controlled at a certain level? Is the government the only one with the role of controlling the commercialization of tourism? So, given these problems, we have done a pre-study of the over-commercialization of Lijiang town in the Yunnan province in the south of China. So Lijiang is in the northwest of Yunnan, and it's an important part of the World Heritage list of UNESCO in 2000. So these villages, these houses have kept very well, and they belong to the Nasi ethnicity with a very famous architectural style. So this village started having this boom in tourism in the 80s. So you can imagine that in 2011, it was over 10 million tourists. And in 2013, it was over 20 million and 50 million in 2019. So this is a trend going up, but it's not gradual. It's very accelerated. So we have done a survey of the storefronts in the old part of town in Lijiang, and this is a traditional street of the village. And from the results of our study, if you can appreciate on the pie chart, these stores, 90% of them in the old town of Lijiang are related to tourism somehow, and 70% of them are directly related to tourism. That is, everything done in the street is directly or indirectly related to tourism. So therefore, they depend heavily on tourism for their livelihood. It is a staggering dependency, and especially the souvenir points, they use a high proportion, and the silverware sales stores are the main souvenir sales. The margin of profit extremely high. You have a lot of tourists buying art, silverware, and crafts. So the margin they're having is about 10 and 30 times. So you have this trend that is very unequal in terms of opportunities. You have an asymmetry of information as well. In this sense, that this asymmetry is so marked that tourists are buying on an exaggerated margin for souvenirs. So in the market, landlords who can pay higher rents will drive the conversion of the street's frontage into stores and changing residential consumption to non-residential consumption. So therefore, the non-residential consumption will be affected heavily by this arrival of tourists. So therefore, we want them. Since the commercialization of tourism is inevitable, is it possible to control it effectively with a foresighted intervention? Let's look at the next case. Let's look at the example of the town of Shidi. This is an ancient village located at the south of the province of Huanghe. In the Anhui province, you might know the Huangshan Mountains. This is a place that has kept old architecture very well from the Qing and Ming dynasties, has 3 ancestral halls very well preserved. So, of course, this architecture is very representative of the Huangshan area. So there we can appreciate this very authentic picture, and this was included in the World Heritage List by UNESCO in 2000. So we did our research to study the use of residential buildings for the street front throughout the main routes for tourists in the map of the tourist guides. So we can appreciate that the storefront that are along the streets in the traditional area are part of the residential part of the stores. That is, the stores, the store people live there, but also trade somehow. So the percentage of trade is 73%. That is primarily focused on tourists. So you have a great percentage where the local business dedicated to tourists is higher than the percentage of the local shops that are dedicated to residential use. So what did the government do? In 2002, the municipal government of Shidi stopped approving business licenses in the villages. So the commercialization of tourism in Shidi has been effectively controlled because of that policy. And the stores and the store operators are mostly local villages. So many people might wonder, by not being given a license, by not giving these businesses a license, how can we help them? So the government, what they have done is to install a new area for trade without touching the old town, and they started attracting some operators, and this commercial street in the new sector of the village, it's a bit of everything: parking spaces, food places, restaurants, etc. So within, we can conclude that if governments intervene, it gets easier to control this excess of commercialization. Without it, it's very hard to do so because villagers, of course, want to make money from tourists. Tourist companies also want to increase their businesses and increase their profit, of course. And also tourists that are not very aware of this, they tend to overbuy souvenirs. So this whole thing is a vicious circle, and that adds to the factor of experts and the government and the media. So based on these 2 concepts and these 2 studies, the commercialization in the old town is the result of the collective choice of government authorities, tourists, shopkeepers, and local residents in the seek of their own interests, and also the differentiated rental prices. So without an external intervention, commercial tourism is inevitable. I believe that local authorities are the ones that have the greatest power to intervene and control the excess of commercialization of tourism. And we should know how to control this and how help local governments to be more capable and be motivated to intervene in a preventable way in this excess of commercialization of tourism in villages. So this was the example of Li Jiang and Xi Di, and now I would like to share my own vision on tourism development of heritage sites under the impact of COVID-19. Firstly, I believe that under the effect of the pandemic, it is very hard for China to go back to their previous levels of industry, of tourism industry. So because they have been affected because of globalization, regionalization, etc., and this partial opening of borders and also the increased prices in flights, people also have psychological problems, people have a different attitude towards tourists and destinations. So short term, it's very hard that international tourism will come back to its previous levels. I believe China needs to rethink the market of post-pandemic tourism. Here we can appreciate that in the last 10 years, the growth of tourism was very sturdy, as you can see from this chart. In 2019, we had a peak of 60 million tourism with incomes of 507 billion of yuan. So in 2020, it was a dramatic slump here, and I believe that increase will also be gradual in the future after the pandemic. And secondly, I believe that the pandemic reconditions the competitiveness of the industry in heritage sites. So we need to readjust the market structure as well. So some SMEs and micro tourism companies and traditional businesses, we have a lot of competitors in the low scales and a lot of less risk resilience capacity. So all of these players will probably withdraw from the market. So we have great opportunities as well for big companies. We have a space there for demand. And the other thing is that under the pandemic influence, we have an accelerating in the digitalization of tourism in heritage sites. So we've had an increase of demand for contactless services, and the digitalization of tourism has gone faster as well. A lot of virtual meetings are being held, a lot of events and exhibitions, virtual tourism, and all of that is because of the pandemic and people not wanting to have person-to-person contact. And with the development of 5G, I believe that will change the surrounding technology of tourism. Recently, Professor Susan mentioned corporate tourism, which I find very interesting. I believe parallel to that, we always need to work on the concept of tourism plus culture, tourism plus business, everything that is tourism plus something added value that is more than welcome for innovation. We need to enrich innovation and optimize it as well. And lastly, I would like to mention in which ways can we focus the sources of visitors in the surrounding areas of the heritage sites. Since as restrictions become non-existent, we need to consider that in the short term, it's very hard to recover tourism. For instance, for school people and students aside, when people travel, they're still facing some very restrictive measurements. But the demand for tourism is still there. And I believe that there is a possible trend of short-term rights for tourism activities, and we need to focus on the sources of the visitors, the tourists. Where are they coming from? How can we expand and optimize and improve our products for tourism? And also, because of time, I would like to finally share my conclusion with you and think that tourism is like a double-edged sword. We should deal with this relationship with the sustainable development of heritage sites. Look at the tourism development in this way. So that is all from me. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Ling Minhu. It was very interesting to listen to your talk on sustainable tourism after the pandemic, how we've done it in Chinese people, how you've done it well, and how has it been done wrong in Latin America, and also how we have done it wrong in Latin America. So thank you so much again. This has been a very interesting vision, very professional of you. Thank you. So now I would like to leave you with Professor Alexandre Silva, a PhD student in business administration, marketing of the School of Tourism of the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, MA in business administration of the same university, specialized in tax auditing, and for many years he has had a license in tourism, also a lawyer, accounting, and guide and tour guide with regional skills in South America and Rio de Janeiro. His studies have been related to culture and also the consumption of deaf people and hospital services as well. So I would like to leave you now with Professor Alexandre Silva. So now your own house, domestic tourism in China and Latin American towns and Caribbean towns. Bem-vindo, Alexandre. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? All right. So it is a great pleasure and a responsibility also to speak to all of the professors, Professor Ling Minyu, that made such a brilliant presentation. It was so nice to listen to both of your presentations, also Susana's presentation of corporate tourism, and giving all of these different views regarding the World Heritage Sites. And this is a vision that I share very much with Professor Ling Minyu. So I'm going to be sharing my presentation now. Thank you. Can you see it? Well, I am the only person that speaks Portuguese among the speakers. It is a challenge for me. So I would like to kindly tell you, say ni hao to all of you, to all of the Chinese friends, and hola a todos to all of these Latin American brothers and sisters. So we're at the middle of the pandemic still, and this is something that we can't forget. And as Professor Susan said, we're used to live with the virus at this point. The tourism is still suffering greatly here in Brazil and in other Latin American countries as well, and still in China. But we still live with some restrictions. So then this proposal that I am bringing today is that we speak about domestic tourism or regional tourism in China, with its dimensions to regional tourism in Latin America, and way that people can take ownership of their own World Heritage sites. And this has a new perspective on leisure tourism. Firstly, China for the Chinese, a road to retake on tourism in China after the pandemic. In this movement that we're still doing until the end of the pandemic, the virus has random outbreaks here and there, and it's a concern of the government, and we as a population are still concerned. So this is a proposal of domestic tourism as a strategy to take over tourism and take it back. So here, we're speaking about this vision in Latin America. So A little bit on China. It's the biggest world population. While the last census they did in the government said that it was 1.4 billion in Chinese world population. So we're talking about the second greatest economy in the world. In Brazil, and more or less 17 trillions in the World Bank. And it's shortly behind Russia and Canada in terms of territory. The population density is a country with a great. I'm sorry, there's a open microphone. So China has great cultural, ethnic, and linguistic plurality. Even though the town also said that, as we said, so in many of the Chinese populations, this will reflect in greater cultural diversity. And we're talking about a country that has 3 big religions, and some began as philosophy, but today they are as Taoism and others. The Chinese people have strong values related to family, and we talk about domestic tourism. It's very interesting when we talk about these figures of tourism and these numbers of tourists that are in circulation. China also brings touristic scenarios for all the flavors and all the profiles as well. So because of the big size and the big possibilities of China, we have a great number of possibilities. So because of still going through the pandemic, the trips will be done via plane as a means of transport, which is a safer means of transport through air. And these are trips that reduce the risk of contagion, or car trips in short distances. So
salirse del canal en portugués y entrar al canal sin idioma para que nuestra intérprete escuche el canal en español. Vamos a ver si podemos solucionar ese tema y vamos probando. Mil disculpas.
We're having some technical problems.
Meu canal, não apareceu. Interpretation. ¿Listo ahora?
Continúe sin ningún problema.
Vamos.
Please continue. So the focus on plane trips as a safe means of transport that reduces the risk of contagion, or by car for short distances, including the big centers such as Beijing and Shanghai. It's also, we have a focus on unique destinations in neighboring cities in order to avoid contact with people of different districts. It's important to remember that the big flow of passengers was what enabled the pandemic in China. And this was a world-sized pandemic, so that is why we're trying to have better prognosis to reach the numbers that we had before the pandemic. And I believe that this is a safe strategy for the virus to be controlled and do family trips or people who meet in the same environments but for shorter periods of time and with a greater focus on destination. So we have smaller groups. As we said, this is a closed environment, and something important for activities that are appealing and that are also outdoors. So, especially for Latin America, that has a lower vision of the Chinese territory, the greatest flow is in the big cities, but China has great jewels as we talk about natural environments. When we talk about domestic tourism as a strategy, that were destined for families, so we can have a proposal and take back on international tourism. These are big spaces that need to be known by tourists all over the world that visit China. So, for instance, the city of Xiaxin has the biggest park in China in Zhangjiajie. It has an open space with great jewels and gems for tourism attractions, the biggest cable cars in the world. That is 300, that is almost 7.5 kilometers long. And we also have the tallest elevator in the world in the open air with 326 meters high. And also, apart from these valleys and canyons, this was a park that was a scenery for the Avatar movie. This was the inspiration for this fascinating movie that enchanted children and adults. The Harbin city in the north of China is also a city that is stunning. It is located in the extreme northern east, close to Siberia, with the border of Russia. And this is a very multicultural place, has the biggest ice festival in the world that starts in December and it goes through February. And the biggest appeal of the region is to know the ice sculptures and the ice buildings with more than 40 meters high sculptures. It is true, winter tends to make tourism go away, but this is open air tourism, and our risk for contagion will decrease drastically because this is an open winter tourist destination. And we hope that we can finish the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's go to regional tourism in Latin America. Sun, sand, and more. The Caribbean, more than sea, it has some natural wealth and cultural wealth as well in Latin America. More than the Caribbean, the vision that we have the Caribbean, we're always associating this to the sea, to the blue sea, but the countries also have a lot of wealth in Brazil and the Caribbean. And we always see this idea of the sea. And it's no different than in Europe, but we have a lot of wealth that can be used inside countries. So speaking of the historic context, and especially for our Chinese friends in Latin America, initially, this is very closely associated to linguistic affairs. So this is from a region of an Italian region called Lazio. It comes from Lazio. So these all of our languages in Latin America are coming from this region of Lazio in Italy. And we have Spanish, French, Italian, French, and Romance. And these are the official languages that are coming from this region. But it's important to remember that the Roman Empire could reach other peoples, and the Latin language also reached linguistic families, such as, for instance, the Anglo-Germanics that speak German and English. And that is why they have a great influence of Latin in these languages with the vocabulary as well. It is important also that we expand the vision of Latin America not only by language, it's also extended by the whole continent, from Mexico, North America, to Argentina in South America. And within this territory, we have a very broad set of cultures, diverse islands and independent territories in the Caribbean, and also countries such as Guyana and Suriname in South America. They don't have Spanish as their main language or their official language, and Portuguese is the only country that, well, Brazil is the only country that doesn't have Portuguese as official language, but we have languages, we have native languages that also got mixed in. It's important to think that this Latin American character has not lost a language, but is a fusion or a mixture of the peoples in a way that the country make what we call Latin American peoples. It is important to also think that Latin America, even if it is seen with even if it's seen as a new world, because Europe was already consolidated for quite some time, when the biggest navigation started, but we had here peoples and cultures that are the cradle of great civilizations, and I mean the Inca, the Mayas, the Aztecs, that populated Mexico, Central America, and South America as well. Even these towns, modern science have discovered that these people had different knowledge and very advanced knowledge, such as astronomy. So there was a lot of life and culture here in the American territory before the arrival of the Europeans. And then, I'm making a separation of the possibilities that we find in Latin America. We can separate destinations of natural origin and the destination of other sites. We have Central America and the Pacific Fire Circle, which is a region where we have technological areas joining volcanic eruptions, where we have big volcanoes, and they're quite appealing for tourists. And we have some in El Salvador. We have an example of, at the bottom of our slide, in Amatepec volcano, which is the tallest and most active volcano in Salvador. And we also have, apart from the coastal areas, we have a lot of green and a lot of exuberance of vegetation. And we have ecotourism and nature tourism. We have two examples, Rio Celeste in Costa Rica, that attracts lovers of ecotourism for trips and because of the water as well. And we also have the Champey Park in Guatemala, which is a tourism and nature park. But when we talk about natural history, Latin America has way more. In Chile, we have the Atacama Desert, that is the tallest and driest desert in the world, that is on the Andes. And that picture I brought here is a picture of the Atacama salt flat, which is a salt desert that geologists can prove the presence of sea before the making of Los Andes mountain range. And we have destinations of human history, and here I bring, as the Professor Min said, the places that need to be preserved by UNESCO. Here we have them in Latin America. We see great cities such as Machu Picchu that were discovered by the beginning of the 20th century in Peru, of the Inca civilization, and is 2,500 meters above sea level of the Pacific Ocean. And we also have the presence of the Maya civilization in countries such as Guatemala and Honduras. And we have there Tikal in Guatemala and the archaeological sites in Copan in Honduras that shows the powerful architecture and the evolution for that time. Considering these are remote times, of course, as well. Considering time, I see that I've covered enough of my presentation. So in regards to this event, I would like to close my presentation with this by talking about this path of considering domestic tourism as a possibility to take over tourism until the end of the pandemic and try to promote domestic tourism in all countries until we can go to normal levels. Thank you very much, Professor Alexander. I would like to thank you for your presentation on Chinese tourism in China and Latin America, as well as the characteristics of our region that make it very different to the rest of the world. Thank you very much. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with Professor Samuel Zhuo. Dr. Samuel Zhuo, professor and researcher of the Autonomous University of Yucatan, with a license in project engineering by University of Burdeos, license and master in geography by the University of Angers University. Is a professor and a joint researcher of the School of Science and Anthropological Science of the Autonomous University of Yucatan, associate researcher to the Mexican and Central American Study Centers. He also works with researchers from Mexico since 2017, and he's also a member of the group of researchers group of touristic processes, mobility, and territory. He has developed a line of research on the interactions between tourism and local societies in rural spaces in Latin America, among others in the continental Caribbean. He is a founding partner of the Mexican Association of Rural Tourism, AMEXTUR, advisor of the corporate societies of COP, MAYAP, since 2015, and a member of the technical team of the Peninsular Alliance for Community Tourism since 2017. He has coordinated the Alternative Tourism Atlas in the Yucatan Tourism and the comic The Other Face of Tourism in the Yucatan Peninsula in 2020, among other projects related to tourism. Professor Samuel Jolt is going to present the presentation 10 Lessons Learned on Community Tourism in Yucatan, Mexico. Welcome, Professor. Thank you very much, Roberto, for this presentation. Thank you very much to your foundation, the PLEC Foundation, for the invitation and for allowing me to share my presentation with you and the other panel members. So I decided this morning to focus on a modality of tourism very similar to ecotourism, which is managed by local societies. So we speak of community tourism. I would like to give you some background information and methodology for my presentation this morning that are focused to work centered on geography, work with geographic information systems, and that have taken us to think that from regional studies as well. So we've also used the participative research action to associate these as tourism services providers that live in rural communities in the Yucatan Peninsula to build communities for learning where in the dialogues of knowledge are key. So if we speak Spanish and we work with many people, men and women that speak the original language of the region, which is Yucatan Maya. And we've also participated in the construction of collaborative networks in terms of for tourism. So that is what I'm going to be telling you about. So firstly, I believe it's important to put this into context. This type of tourism, which is a community tourism, this is an alternative to the sun and beach tourism, where in these ways of tourism, many times, you have tourism that is intended for the masses, for the large numbers of audiences. And in our case, this is an alternative to tourism that is complementary to mass tourism. This is an alternative tourism that is complementary to the neoliberal economic model. Many of these companies that I'm going to be telling you about, we could say are SMEs or medium-sized or small-sized companies that are socially based, and many times they are co-ops. But more than everything in the region, this region of the Mexican Southeast, this type of tourism is an alternative to the primary activities that are agricultural activities, such as Milpa, which is an agroecological system that was found in Mesoamerica and that has more than 2,000 years of existence, and it is still being used in some places. But also, there are producers of different types of activities. So, also, as a second point, these companies are these social companies. I apologize. These social companies are, we can differentiate them in the private sector and the public sector as well of the economy. So these social companies, we might have the private sector and the public sector, and they come from the social sector. And finally, we have a relationship between these groups and what we call communities and the commoners as well. So it's all part of the community. The labor operations and solidarity operations that are here and that are present in one group or company, the committee, and the rest of this location. So let's go into these details. To reinforce this, I believe we have three criteria that cannot be discussed in order to define community tourism. First, social property of the land of the team and the infrastructure. And a second point would be the stakeholders have a collective decision-making process and an equal distribution of income. And finally, to acquire the competences, these stakeholders of social companies, they acquire them through horizontal processes and solidarity processes as well. And those would be the criteria to define community tourism that are present in all of Latin America. So going quickly to these 10 lessons that we've learned. What have we learned about these sectors through these 25 years? First, this tourism is linked to what we call in Mexico social property. And social property means that several people are owners of the land. So what we observe is a moving of some sort between the decision making of what we call an ejido, the social propriety in the Yucatan area, and these co-ops. And therefore, we have a low incorporation of women as partners, and also a low participation of the youth as partners as well. As a second lesson, what we have observed is that we have a strong link between several aspects of the Maya culture and these co-ops. So we could speak of the Farina in Mexico and the southeast of Yucatan area is collective work. And this is work that is done for free in a way by those who have this type of companies. And they work for the maintenance of the tourism site. Then this tourism, this type of tourism, inserts itself into this dynamic of pluri-activity of farm work. So we also have a delegation of work in the sense that the parents or grandparents that were invited to participate in these projects invite the children and the grandchildren to participate as well. And where this is present, what we used to call these anthropologists to learn through observation and also pitching, learning by observing and pitching in, which is Lopi in English. And the third lesson we learned here, we realized that families were playing an important role in this type of co-ops. It could be farm families or also co-ops where most of the members belong to 1, 2, or 3 families that are extended. Fourth lesson that is very important as well, and it's linked to this observation on families, is that we observe that the workers of these co-ops, even if the law of co-op work means that a worker after 365 days, that is 1 year, could become a partner, many times they stay in this sort of scheme of wage labor. But these workers have kinship relationship with the partners anyways. So here you can see in the image, you have one of the partners of a company in the south of Tulum, and he's in this co-op. We have many family members of the Kamal family. As a fifth lesson is how do these companies today have been formed collaborative networks to penetrate the market. That is, starting from their logic, they have created second level organizations to start trading community tourism. So an example where with the collaboration of the Yucatan Autonomous University, where many students get involved in these type of activities. We in the university are located here in Mérida, Yucatan, and we have many students that come from communities in the rural area, and they get involved in these type of social companies. So more than 50 social companies are going to be organized in a second level company. So also, sixth lesson, we realized that the government subsidies have played an important role. This type of tourism in Mexico and other parts of Latin America have had an influence on the state and the international agendas. So many times the amount of the funding does not provide the expected results, in the sense that it seems that high amounts of funding does not translate into better economic performance. So it doesn't translate in more income or more tourists. In this map, you can see the distribution of the social companies that dedicate to this type of activity. And I believe that you can realize this is not a residual activity, in the sense that in 2015, you have more than 2 centers of social companies identifying themselves in this activity. As a seventh lesson, how we've seen several processes of privatization that can be both formal or undercover, where social property of land is somehow affected by the tourist activity, and this happens in different ways. What we have realized is that when you put some economic value on a territory where you have different natural resources, as it was presented by the previous presenters, you're going to have fewer possibilities of granting this social property towards other people. Lesson number 8, and maybe this is a key point here. Not any place can be a tourist destination, in the sense that we observe today the penetration of tourism in rural spaces, not only in Latin America, but particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula, where we have the city of Cancun, that many of you might know or heard of, that before the pandemic have received 26 million people in the airport. This is the most important tourism hub in Latin America. And this brings tourism to different areas as well. And this is associated to this mega project that in the region called the Maya Train, where we want to share that idea that not every destination can become a tourist destination, and the geographic localization is very important. Lesson number 9. This aspect of the model of horizontal training. So what has been the most efficient way of doing this type of meetings between stakeholders that acquire touristic experience through the exchange of experiences, where many times these spaces take place in the Yucatan Mayan area, and you need to highlight here the importance of some local experts as well. Lesson number 10, the lesson that gathers us today, which is where we have realized that this type of tourism is particularly, I need to be careful with this word, resilience, because I believe humans are not springs, and we don't necessarily bounce back of every situation. And this pandemic has shown that we're not. But this type of tourism, we want to know about the resilience of this type of tourism in the face of all of these situations. This is a tourism that recovers relatively fast, and where again, the main stakeholders are farmers, fishermen and women, milpers, and people who dedicate to other activities and that also work on tourism. So then, during this pandemic, we have been able to accompany some initiatives, and this is one of the results, a pocket map that we did, thinking of that these tourists that didn't know this mode of tourism before the crisis, and that during the crisis has made it almost trendy. So we have cheap prices that allow for the access to more and more people for this type of map, and also for this type of tourism eventually. We've decided with some colleagues to draft a guide to discover different social companies in the southeast of Mexico, and that is thinking that this type of tourism should also be opened beyond an academic people, and beyond a knowledgeable audience, and that this can be a type of tourism that can be interesting also to international tourists. And I would like to close my presentation with this slide by thanking the space for sharing my work and that we have done with these service providers. That is my email, the website of ResearchGate, where you can find different types of materials on the topic, and also the Peninsular the Viaja Turismo Comunitario website as well. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Samuel. I'd like to thank you. This has been a very interesting presentation on community tourism in the Yucatan area, and especially on the possibilities that this type of tourism can have for this type of post-pandemic, and that is absolutely different. It goes into another sense to the mass tourism that takes place in Mexico and the Caribbean in general. So this has been very interesting. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to know if there are any questions. We had two questions, I believe. One for Professor Hemingway that was about tourism in World Heritage Sites in China. This type of tourism, they tried to promote it very much in China, especially to try to get these communities out of poverty, which happened, definitely. However, facing the situation, what is the forecast that you see for these World Heritage Site cities, and the difference that you made between these two cities, one that was absolutely focused and almost dedicated entirely in terms of architecture and services to tourism, and another city that had a different version of this? Fortunately, I've been lucky enough to visit both. When you have mass tourism outside of the city, and inside you have tourism that people can visit, but not the massive trend. So what is your assessment towards the future? Thank you very much for your question. Both cities have been our objective for our study. And I have the same perception of that excess of commercialization on gentrification, and that they're in excess. I believe these villages can't stand any more tourists than they already have, and especially when these businesses have been a bit affected, because most of them have been destined for tourism. There's no services for local people. So that is a product. I believe there was a lack of control, and when they realized that this was out of control, they realized they needed to take some measurements to control this. So, for instance, in terms of the trade of silverware that had a profit margin of 30–40%, that is exaggerated even for tourism. You have tourists willing to pay for something that is completely insignificant for 3,000 yuan. That's an exaggeration. But I believe that in that way, this forced the government to take some measurements in order to face these consequences for the access of tourism. But I believe that GD has done that better, but in a more balanced way as well, because when they were almost on the verge of falling into this gentrification and commercialization of their city, they stopped giving commercial and business licenses in order to protect the village. And in order to prevent that, what they did, the best thing I thought they did, was to enable a new area without touching the old town for trade and do that all of that side in the outskirts of the village. So tourists are detoured to this area in order to, so they don't crowd out the village without affecting the old town. So that is all my answer. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ling Ming Hee. I would like to ask Susan, you talked about the need for working regionally and jointly with tourism in the binational tours and corporate tourism. This is a specialized form of tourism. What are the actions that you believe are possible in the post-pandemic? Because sometimes it's very hard to agree on something with institutions of different countries. It's not easy to from coordinating dates for trade shows and that sort of thing to do them jointly. How could you say that we could do this coordination? Maybe there has been a coordination that came from the private sector rather than the public sector or the academia in certain areas. In general, if you look at the international events done in Latin America, there has been some business intelligence where they have been working from the business chamber and the union organization from the productive sectors. So when we talk about mining, we realize that if Expo Min is going to take place in Chile, most likely Peru, in very close dates, will develop some Expo Mina. Colombia would do an event on hydrocarbon as well. So you have this complementarity that has been happening naturally and that is coming from the demand of the market. And also taking on the advantages that in the case of Chile have taken place in the work with the Chinese delegations that participate in the international trade shows in the events in Chile. So if you think about not only Expo Min, but other trade shows of other productive sectors, such as in architecture and construction, Chile has been having a record attendance of pavilions with more than 150 companies participating. And that's already a reference in the coordination. When you have a success story, coordination becomes a bit more, it becomes easier. So I believe the main factor to generate coordination should continue to be this motivation of the private sector that proposes the public sector, as it is the case happening with the Business Council in the Pacific Alliance, where the Business Council proposes activities for the Pacific Alliance as a multilateral agreement will carry them out as coordinated activity by the 4 countries comprising that entity. Thank you very much, Susan. Professor Zhou, this community tourism without a doubt in the Maya region is mass tourism. Chinese know it as the beach Caribbean mass tourism, and also archaeological tourism in Chichen Itza and other cities such as Uxmal. So have you considered to be able to sell, quote unquote, or promote community tourism for foreigners, especially now in this seminar where we're seeing what about Chinese tourists as well? Thank you very much, Roberto, for this question that is so present. And I would like to begin by a heritage element, which is the Milpa Maya. Milpa Maya is a smart system of the a world farming system. And you might know that we have the most of these systems is, well, in China. So how this imaginary that has been working very well in France, the Chinese tourists only visits spaces that are for wine producing in the Bourgogne region, but also lavender fields in the south of France. But I think it's very important to create these imaginary spaces that are associated to the built patrimony such as Chichen Itza or Ibalam in the region. So this is one of the aspects that I find very relevant, this imagination linked to a landscape that is the Milpa Maya. And on the second part of the question, which is about the trading systems, as of now, for more than 10 years, we've been collaborating with the United Nations Program for the Development in order to work in a bottoms-up way in the construction of trading systems or commercialization systems through co-op unions or alliances. The Peninsular Alliance for Community Tourism is a third-level organization that is the stakeholders themselves of this type of tourism, many times that are from Maya origin, organized to penetrate the market. And an example of all of these companies is the example of Xancat, which is 15 kilometers south of Tulum, of this great corridor, as it was presented, of the Quintanaro tourism, which is great tourism in a way. And they've been able to offer added value products, and they've been able to capture some of these tourists through these sort of journey, through channels in a protected area called the Reserve for the Biosphere of Siancan, and they've been able to penetrate the market. So I believe that what they're doing here in the region is very relevant, and also we have experiences that will allow to attract Chinese tourism as well. It's worth mentioning as well that, of course, this is not a tourism that it is as massive. Many times in these communities, you have small groups, but I believe we have seen this in other tourist destinations. Chinese tourism does not move only in great consortiums. There are also, I don't know, suitable transports to 12 or 15 people, so that they're small vans. Thank you very much, Samuel. Thank you very much, everyone. Again, thanks, Susan, Ling Minhui. Thank you very much, Professor Alexandre Silva and Samuel Jourd. And especially, I would like to thank Ling Minhui, because for her it's almost midnight in China, and she has been patiently with us today. This has been a very interesting presentation. What we wanted to do as CLEC Foundation is to make an analysis of the post-pandemic tourism, a vision from China that was wonderfully presented by Ling Minhui, and also a vision from Latin America that was also brilliantly presented and very nicely executed by Susan Rojas, Samuel Jourd, and Alexandre Silva. So without a doubt, this video will be sent out to everyone, also to the institutions who teach Chinese and also tourism institutions. Not everyone can log in at this time or at the time of the forums, but the biggest part of the visits are in our YouTube channel. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Xie, obrigado, Ms. Biku. Muchas gracias. And let's meet back in another presentation. Thanks, everyone. Bye.